In May of 1945, the Soviet army entered Berlin. The red flag was placed over the German parliament. Before that moment, the troops had crossed Poland and triumphed in the Battle of Seelow, one of the last major engagements on the Eastern Front. The war in Europe had ended. The Soviet Union emerged, strengthened and extended its presence over several countries in the eastern part of the continent. With the victory, a new stage began. Reconstruction, control of power, and the organization of the system were left in the hands of those who had led the war. The model was rigid. Decisions were made centrally and were not subject to discussion. Over the years, some tried to maintain that course, others sought to change it. There were swift downfalls. One was arrested and executed. Another ended up relegated to a distant post. What did those who came to power after the war do, and what was their fate? Stalin, from war leadership to absolute rule. During the Second World War, Iosif Stalin personally directed military operations as Supreme Commander of the Red Army. Since 1941, he also presided over the State Defense Committee, concentrating political, military and economic power. All strategic decisions went through him. He led key campaigns such as the defense of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad, where orders prohibited retreat or surrender. His role was presented as decisive for victory and reinforced his total authority within the Soviet system. At the end of the conflict, the Soviet Union emerged as a military and territorial power. The Red Army controlled much of Eastern Europe. Stalin attended the Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam conferences, where he reached agreements with the United States and the United Kingdom on the reorganization of the continent. He presented himself as one of the architects of the New World Order and, within the country, as the leader who had saved the homeland. After 1945, his focus shifted to internal reconstruction and control of the socialist bloc. The Soviet infrastructure was severely damaged. Destroyed cities, collapsed railway networks, and widespread shortages marked the post-war period. The state organized recovery through centralized plans that prioritized heavy industry, energy, and the military system. Consumer goods and social improvements were relegated. Agriculture, maintained in collective farms, continued with low levels of production and precarious conditions for peasants. At the political level, control remained absolute. Stalin retained leadership of the party and reorganized its top structure, replacing the Politburo with a larger presidium. Although this formally broadened decision-making, in practice he continued to decide alone. No leader had any real autonomy. Proposals were approved without discussion, and internal differences were resolved through discrete reassignments or arrests. Ideological vigilance was also strengthened. The social sciences and culture were subordinated to the official doctrine. Writers, historians, and economists had to adhere to the imposed line. Any deviation was considered suspicious. A worldview centered on the fight against internal and external enemies was promoted. Censorship was strict, and propaganda campaigns exalted the role of the state and the party as guarantors of stability. In Eastern Europe, countries under Soviet occupation established governments controlled by local communist parties with direct support from Moscow. Initial coalitions were replaced by one-party regimes. In countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, political, economic and cultural structures inspired by the Soviet model were imposed. Direct intervention in the internal affairs of these states was justified as a guarantee of security and ideological unity. Relations within the ruling circle were tense. Stalin did not name a successor or promote collective leadership. Officials like Molotov, Kaganovich, Beria, or Malenov were used for specific tasks, but none had stable power. As he aged, his distrust increased. In his final years, he launched anti-Semitic campaigns, such as the case of the doctors accused of conspiracy. Deportations of certain ethnic groups were also planned, although they were never carried out. The cult of his personality continued to grow. In 1949, his 70th anniversary was celebrated with mass events. His name was constantly mentioned in speeches, schoolbooks, films, and public events. Despite his limited public activity after 1948, he remained the center of the system. He governed from his residence, surrounded by officials who delivered reports to him, but without direct contact with most of the apparatus. In March of 1953, he suffered a stroke. Several hours passed before he received medical attention, and he died on the 5th. He left no instructions regarding succession, nor had he clearly delegated responsibilities. His death created immediate uncertainty. The closest leaders quickly organized a new distribution of power, fearing that the lack of decisions might trigger internal conflicts. The structure he left behind was designed to function under his personal authority. Economic planning, political control, and foreign policy were based on centralized decisions and repression of dissent. Without him, the system lacked clear mechanisms to adapt or renew itself. The period following his death would be marked by attempts to redefine the country's direction without breaking from the model he had consolidated. Beria, from the core of power to execution. Lavrenti Beria entered Stalin's inner circle in 1938 when he was appointed head of the NKVD, the agency in charge of state security. His rise coincided with the peak of the Great Terror. From that position, he became one of the most feared figures in the Soviet system. Under his leadership, the repressive apparatus maintained surveillance over all social sectors. His reputation for brutality originated in Georgia, where he systematically ordered torture and executions. In Moscow, the interrogations under his charge were known for their cruelty, and his office became synonymous with immediate punishment. During the Second World War, Beria had no direct military role, but his power continued to grow. He was responsible for internal security, oversaw the mass deportations of minorities accused of collaborating with the enemy, and maintained discipline through control of the NKVD. He organized the execution of Polish officers in Katyn in 1940 and directed the administration of the Gulag camps, whose population was used as labor during the war. Although he rarely appeared in public, he participated in the most important decisions, always subordinate to Stalin, but with effective influence over the life and death of millions. After the victory in 1945, Beria was rewarded with more responsibilities. His rank within the government was consolidated, and he also began to be involved in strategic matters such as the Soviet nuclear program. He oversaw the construction of testing facilities and controlled the human and material resources allocated to the atomic bomb. His management was considered efficient. In 1949, when the first Soviet nuclear test was successfully carried out, he received public recognition. He appeared satisfied, although restrained according to witnesses of the time. During these years, Beria also participated in internal purges. Together with Malenov, he contributed to dismantling Zhdanov's circle after his death. Several officials close to Zhdanov were arrested and executed, reflecting the usual power struggles in Stalin's environment. Beria remained an ambiguous figure, useful for controlling the apparatus, but also feared by his colleagues in the Politburo. In his relations with Stalin, he maintained a publicly subordinate attitude. However, in private, Beria showed contempt for the dictator. After Stalin's death in March of 1953, he did not hide his lack of respect. In the following days, he appeared active and confident. He was one of the most visible leaders during the funeral and took part in the initial division of power. He assumed control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, MVD, which at that time had also absorbed the former Ministry of State Security, MGB. This merger gave him unprecedented control over the political police, prisons, and party surveillance. From that position, he promoted immediate reforms. He released the doctors accused in the so-called doctors' plot and publicly announced that the evidence was false. He also proposed reviewing other previous trials, allowing prisoners to be released from the Gulag. His intention was to reduce the reliance on terror as a tool of governance. These measures initially had some support within sectors of the party, but they also triggered alarm in others. In foreign policy, he proposed major changes. He spoke of relaxing control over Eastern European countries, promoting a more flexible approach with communist governments. In secret, he even re-established contact with Yugoslavia, whose break with Stalin had been considered a betrayal. He also proposed concessions to non-Russian republics within the USSR, aiming to ease ethnic tensions. These actions were seen as attempts to gain political support outside the central apparatus. Despite his moves, Beria was considered a threat by his colleagues. His dominance over the security apparatus made him fearsome. It was said that he had compromising information on all members of the Presidium, accumulated during years of surveillance. Khrushchev and Malenov began to organize a plot to remove him. Beria, overconfident, took no precautions. In June of 1953, during a Presidium meeting, he was arrested by surprise. Khrushchev had coordinated the operation with Marshal Zhukov, who handled the military deployment. Beria was taken from the Kremlin in a car and placed under army custody. His arrest was announced a few days later. On July 2nd, at a Central Committee meeting, his crimes were presented: abuse of power, ideological deviations, and, in a scarcely credible accusation, espionage for the United Kingdom. The accusation was unanimously approved. The trial was held behind closed doors. Beria was convicted and executed in December of that same year. With his fall, the party reorganized the security apparatus. In 1954, the MVD was split again, creating the KGB as a separate institution in charge of intelligence and counterintelligence. These reforms aimed to prevent a single person from concentrating so much power again. The subsequent leadership took note of the methods that had enabled Beria's rise and sought to prevent their repetition. Beria's figure sums up the excesses of the Soviet system under Stalin. He was the executor of purges, architect of repressive control, and later, a defender of limited change that never materialized. His end was a direct consequence of the fear he himself had sown. His time in power was as influential as it was brief in the post-war period. After his execution, his name was removed from official speeches and erased from public records. For decades, he was not officially mentioned in Soviet history. Malenov, the fleeting successor and his political downfall. Georgy Malenov was one of the leaders who rose the most within the Stalinist system during the war and post-war years. His career advanced through technical and organizational roles, earning Stalin's trust for his efficiency in administrative tasks. During the Second World War, he participated in coordinating the arms industry and mobilizing human resources for the front. Although he was not a prominent public figure, his influence quietly grew in the planning bodies and the central offices of the party. At the end of the conflict, Malenov was included in Stalin's inner circle. His prominence increased especially after the death of Zhdanov in 1948. Together with Beria, he organized a purge against Zhdanov's network of allies in Leningrad and other regions. Dozens of officials were executed, including high members of the Politburo. This episode strengthened his position as one of the possible heirs to Soviet leadership. In Stalin's final years, Malenov was in charge of key reports and was appointed to deliver important speeches, which presented him as his official spokesman. At the 19th Party Congress in 1952, he read the Central Report on behalf of the Central Committee, while Stalin remained silent. This was interpreted as a symbolic act of delegation. However, there were no clear guarantees of succession. Stalin's concentration of power prevented any real autonomy among his collaborators, who had to stick strictly to the official line. After Stalin's death in March of 1953, Malenov was appointed chairman of the Council of Ministers and secretary of the Central Committee, formally positioning him as the new head of government. His vice presidents were Beria and Molotov. The rest of the Presidium maintained a collegial structure, but Malenov was initially considered the strongest leader. At Stalin's funeral, his speech was the most sober and political, a sign that he aimed to project himself as a leader of continuity, but with a less repressive tone. In the first months, he promoted an image of controlled change. He advocated for a policy of reduced military spending, increased production of consumer goods, and a more cautious foreign policy. In the Supreme Soviet, he presented a budget that reduced agricultural taxes and increased payments to collective farms. He also tried to boost an industry more oriented to the population's needs, in contrast to the arms-focused production model that had dominated in previous years. However, these ideas met resistance. The structure of the party and state apparatus had been shaped by decades of prioritizing the military and heavy industrial sectors. Furthermore, within the Presidium, figures such as Khrushchev were promoting their own projects, like the exploitation of virgin lands, which ended up gaining more support among regional cadres and among the more conservative sectors of the party in their economic vision. A tactical error weakened his position. In March of 1953, he resigned from his position as secretary of the Central Committee to focus on his role as head of government. This decision allowed Khrushchev to take control of the party, a power that soon proved to be more influential than that of the Council of Ministers itself. Although Malenkov remained the formal leader, his ability to set policies without party backing gradually diminished. The relationship between Malenkov and Beria was initially collaborative. Both supported the release of the doctors accused in the Doctors' Plot and were in favor of reducing the repressive role of the police apparatus. However, Beria's accumulation of power in the Ministry of Internal Affairs caused fear among the other leaders. Malenkov supported the conspiracy led by Khrushchev that ended with Beria's arrest in June of 1953. This action temporarily strengthened his position in the government. After that episode, Malenkov briefly reinforced his influence. But party control was already in Khrushchev's hands, who began organizing support against him. Throughout 1954, Malenkov's authority in the Presidium weakened. In February of 1955, he was forced to resign as chairman of the Council of Ministers, replaced by Nikolai Bulganin, a Khrushchev ally. Although he remained in the Presidium, his role was clearly secondary. After his removal, he tried to form an alliance with Molotov and Kaganovich to halt Khrushchev's rise. In 1957, these three leaders led an attempt to depose Khrushchev during a Presidium meeting. Although they initially gained a majority, the Central Committee was urgently convened and the coup was neutralized. Khrushchev consolidated his power and the three were expelled from the Presidium. Malenkov was demoted to secondary positions. In the following years, he was appointed director of a hydroelectric plant in Kazakhstan. He never again held high-level state functions. His time in power was brief but significant. He represented a moderate alternative within the Stalinist structure, but lacked the political strength to impose a new direction. His inclination toward a consumption-oriented economy, his proposal for more peaceful relations with the West, and his rejection of police violence set him apart from many of his contemporaries. However, his organizational weakness and lack of charisma prevented him from building lasting support within the party. Molotov, from the pact with Hitler to marginalization in the Khrushchev era. Vyacheslav Molotov became one of the most visible official voices of the Soviet Union on the international stage. As Commissar of Foreign Affairs, he led key negotiations with Western powers and represented the Kremlin at crucial moments in global politics. He was a central figure in the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, and during the war, he remained a negotiator and spokesperson at diplomatic conferences with the Allies. His career, which began in the early years of the regime, positioned him as one of Stalin's most consistent collaborators. During the Second World War, he held a prominent position in the State Defense Committee. He participated in strategic decisions alongside Stalin, Malenkov, and other top leaders. He was responsible for signing international treaties, coordinating diplomatic missions, and maintaining relations with the Allies. He traveled to London and Washington, representing the Kremlin at key conferences. His rigid style and disciplined language made him a difficult but effective negotiator in the context of Soviet diplomacy. At the end of the war, he continued as Commissar of Foreign Affairs. He led foreign policy during the creation of the Socialist bloc in Eastern Europe. He participated in the negotiations that imposed communist regimes in countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. He firmly defended Soviet positions against Western powers at the United Nations Security Council and in international conferences on disarmament, borders, and economic cooperation. After Stalin's death in 1953, Molotov was included in the initial division of power. He was confirmed as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Vice President of the Council of Ministers. However, his figure began to lose influence compared to younger leaders like Khrushchev and reformists like Malenkov. Although he remained in the leadership, his role was more conservative, and he often opposed the proposals for change that arose in the Presidium's debates. As Khrushchev strengthened his control over the party, Molotov became increasingly isolated. Khrushchev's reformist ideas clashed with Molotov's defense of Stalin's legacy and the centralized model he had helped build. In 1956, during the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech denouncing the crimes of Stalinism. Molotov tried to prevent it and proposed that the central theme of the Congress be Stalin, the continuer of Lenin's work. He failed to impose his position. Khrushchev had the support of the majority of the Presidium. Molotov was forced to listen to the criticisms of the period he had personally shaped. He opposed the direction of the Congress, but he could not reverse it. From that moment on, his position visibly weakened. In 1957, along with Malenov and Kaganovich, he led an attempt to remove Khrushchev during a presidium meeting. They obtained a provisional majority to abolish the position of First Secretary, hoping to dissolve his leadership. But Khrushchev mobilized the support of the Central Committee, bringing its members to Moscow in a coordinated move with Marshal Zhukov. The committee's plenary backed Khrushchev and dismissed the three conspirators. Molotov was expelled from the Presidium and the party secretariat. In a symbolic decision, he was appointed ambassador to Mongolia. He went from being one of the most influential figures in the state to holding a minor diplomatic post far from the political center. This change represented not only his personal fall, but also the defeat of the old Stalinist guard in the new balance of Soviet power. In the following years, Molotov lived in an ambiguous situation. Although he was neither arrested nor physically purged, he was excluded from active politics. His name was removed from the press, and his historical role was minimized in official documents. He did not participate in the writing of memoirs or in party events. In private, he maintained his defense of the model he had helped build. He expressed neither regret nor revision of his actions during the Stalinist period. One of the most personal events for Molotov was the arrest of his wife, Polina Jemchugina, during Stalin's final purges. Although she was rehabilitated in 1956, the episode marked his relationship with the rest of the leadership. The release of millions of Gulag prisoners in the years following the 20th Congress contrasted with his active role in earlier purges, contributing to his continued exclusion from the new political projects of the regime. His final exclusion came in 1961, when he was expelled from the Communist Party. The Congress that year considered his loyalty to Stalinism incompatible with the party's current line. Although he had held no office since 1957, the formal expulsion closed off any chance of rehabilitation during his lifetime. In the years that followed, he lived away from the media in Moscow, under informal surveillance. He refused interviews, did not publish memoirs, and limited himself to private exchanges with former collaborators. He died in 1986, at the age of 96, without ever being officially rehabilitated. His career was one of the longest in the history of Soviet power. He was present from the early years of the regime, participated in the most decisive decisions of the Second World War, and in the consolidation of the socialist bloc. His fall reflected the displacement of a generation of leaders whose loyalty to Stalinism no longer had a place in the new political context of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, reforms, contradictions, and dismissal. Nikita Khrushchev was one of the most prominent Soviet leaders after Stalin's death. His political career had begun decades earlier, with participation in the labor movement during the First World War and Bolshevik militancy since 1918. He rose through the party structure after studying at the Moscow Industrial Academy, and in the 1930s became a key figure in Ukraine and Moscow. During the Great Terror, he supported the purges, though he also demonstrated administrative efficiency. In the Second World War, he served as a political commissar on the Southern Front, participating in the defense of Stalingrad and other campaigns. Upon returning to Moscow, Stalin appointed him Secretary of the Central Committee in 1949, aiming to balance the positions of Malenov and other party officials. This appointment brought him closer to the core of power in Stalin's final years. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev was named first secretary of the Communist Party, initially within a collegial structure alongside Malenov, Beria, and Molotov. Gradually, he consolidated his position, maneuvering to weaken his rivals. He actively participated in the arrest of Beria in June of 1953, an action that marked his assertion within the political apparatus. From the outset, Khrushchev advocated for a renewal of the system without abandoning the foundations of the one-party state. His first major project was the Virgin Lands campaign in Kazakhstan and Siberia, which mobilized millions of people. The initial result was an increase in grain production, although it would not be sustained in the long term. At the same time, he promoted an administrative reorganization that fragmented central ministries and transferred functions to regional economic councils, aiming to energize economic management. One of his most significant acts was the secret speech of 1956 at the 20th Party Congress. There he denounced Stalin's crimes, criticized the cult of personality, and acknowledged widespread abuses. This gesture was a turning point in Soviet politics. Internally, it caused shock. Internationally, it weakened the cohesion of the socialist bloc. Protests broke out in Poland and Hungary, and the subsequent repression showed that the limits of change were still tightly controlled by the Kremlin. Despite his denunciation of Stalinism, Khrushchev retained elements of the previous system. He reinforced the party's role as the state's guiding force and preserved the centralized planning structure. Economically, he combined technical reforms with voluntaristic campaigns. In agriculture, he promoted the expansion of kolkhozes, the creation of sovkhozes, and the reduction of private plots. Between 1950 and 1960, production of wheat, milk, and meat increased significantly. However, the model continued to rely more on political decisions than on structural efficiency. In foreign policy, he sought to reduce tensions with the West. He met with Eisenhower and later with Kennedy, advocating peaceful coexistence. Nevertheless, his unpredictable style created uncertainty. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he decided to withdraw Soviet weaponry without consulting the Presidium, which was interpreted as a retreat. Although he avoided a nuclear conflict, his unilateral handling of the episode eroded his authority among party leaders. Internally, he attempted to reform the party apparatus. In 1961, he imposed term limits on posts, a measure that unsettled many mid-level cadres. He also divided regional committees into separate branches for agriculture and industry, creating administrative duplication. These decisions increased discontent among local officials and within the Presidium, where his reorganizations were seen as arbitrary and inefficient. Ideologically, he promoted an optimistic discourse about communism. He claimed that the USSR would surpass capitalism in quality of life. The massive construction of housing, the expansion of consumption, and improvements in nutrition seemed to support this. However, structural imbalances remained. Heavy industry continued to be prioritized, and the reforms failed to change the regime's investment pattern. In 1963, a poor harvest forced the import of grain, exposing the limits of his agricultural model. Khrushchev also had an impact on cultural life. The publication of critical works such as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn was permitted. There was a brief period of openness in literature, film, and music. However, when certain authors crossed the boundaries defined by the party, restrictions were reimposed. Censorship was revived, though less severely than during Stalin's time. His personal style caused divisions. He combined populist enthusiasm with abrupt decisions. He intervened directly in technical matters, ignoring experts. At the United Nations, he interrupted a speech by banging his shoe on the table, reinforcing his image as an unpredictable leader. At the same time, he accumulated posts and sought personal recognition, despite having criticized the cult of personality. His figure appeared daily in the press, and his family received political favors, such as the appointment of his son-in-law to head Izvestia. In October of 1964, he was dismissed by the Presidium of the Central Committee itself. His opponents, led by Brezhnev, Suslov, and Kosygin, argued that his leadership had been erratic. The dismissal was discreetly organized. Upon his return from a vacation, he was taken to a meeting where he was asked to resign. He accepted without resistance, understanding that his time had come to an end. He was allowed to retire and lived in Moscow until his death in 1971, far removed from political life. Brezhnev: stability, stagnation, and decline. Leonid Brezhnev rose in Soviet politics as part of the generation that followed the Civil War. Born in 1906 into a Russian working-class family in Ukraine, he joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, standing out for his discipline and adaptability. His ascent was solidified during the Second World War, where he served as a political commissar on the southern and Ukrainian fronts. After the conflict, his relationship with Khrushchev benefited him, and he was promoted to key positions in Moldova and later in the central apparatus of the party. In 1964, he participated in the removal of Nikita Khrushchev. He was designated First Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that was later renamed General Secretary. He shared power with other leaders like Kosygin and Podgorny in a collective structure, but over time he asserted himself as the central figure. His initial goal was to restore administrative order after the turmoil of previous years. He reversed several of Khrushchev's reforms, reinstated central ministries, and abandoned the sectoral divisions in party committees. On the economic front, he favored continuity. Although he allowed Kosygin to promote some decentralization-oriented reforms, he blocked any attempt to alter the fundamentals of centralized planning. The initial growth in agriculture and industry between 1965 and 1970 reinforced his authority. However, the early dynamism gradually stalled. In the 1970s, productivity declined, technological innovation was limited, and the bureaucracy became more rigid. Massive investments failed to produce proportional results. Even so, a relative welfare policy was maintained. Real wages increased, housing construction was promoted, and social services were expanded. By 1980, access to appliances and basic goods had improved compared to the 1950s. However, structural imbalances persisted. Agriculture continued to rely on massive subsidies, and the USSR became a regular grain importer. The economic system depended largely on revenue from hydrocarbon exports, whose price increases in the 70s prevented a major fiscal crisis. In foreign policy, Brezhnev sought to maintain the Soviet Union's international prestige. He promoted détente with the United States, signing arms limitation agreements with Nixon and Carter. He traveled to Washington and hosted Western leaders in Moscow. At the same time, he actively supported revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and increased military cooperation with allies like Cuba and Vietnam. In 1979, the invasion of Afghanistan marked a turning point in this policy, triggering a prolonged crisis that deteriorated relations with the West and heightened internal tensions. Brezhnev's cultural management combined selective repression with limited tolerance. While some margins of criticism were allowed in moderate forms, works that questioned the system or Stalinist past were censored. Repression against dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a constant. The samizdat system became a clandestine channel for the circulation of unofficial ideas and literature. Political surveillance and self-censorship dominated Soviet intellectual life during this period. Under Brezhnev, the power structure became a gerontocracy. The average age of the Politburo increased progressively, and generational renewal was blocked. The party apparatus was filled with officials promoted by Brezhnev from his years in Dnipropetrovsk, creating a loyal but uninnovative network. Important decisions were made by consensus, avoiding open conflicts, but also preventing substantial reforms. This stability was interpreted as stagnation by many internal sectors of the state. On a personal level, Brezhnev cultivated the image of an affable leader, though he also accumulated personal privileges. He allowed nepotism within his family circle and tolerated high levels of corruption in the corridors of power. His health deteriorated severely in the 1980s. He suffered from multiple ailments, took medication continuously, and required permanent medical attention. Despite this, he remained in office, supported by an entourage that feared the political effects of his retirement. The inertia of the system prevented the preparation of an orderly transition. Between 1980 and 1982, his participation in public affairs declined significantly. Appearances were sporadic, and his communication was limited. In practice, decisions were made by figures such as Ustinov, Andropov, Gromyko, and Chernenko, in an unofficial collective leadership. The absence of effective leadership increased disorganization. At the same time, reports of corruption scandals in his family began to circulate, promoted by political rivals like Andropov from within the KGB. Brezhnev died on November 10, 1982. His funeral was formal, with no public displays of emotional mourning from the elite. Although he was given official honors, his passing was seen as a relief by many party leaders. He was buried in Red Square in a marshal's uniform with all his decorations. His time in government, which had begun with promises of stability and improvement, ended with a paralyzed system, unable to respond effectively to the accumulating economic, social, and political problems. Yuri Andropov, between surveillance and failed reform. Yuri Andropov assumed leadership of the Soviet Union in November of 1982, following the death of Leonid Brezhnev. His political career was extensive. He was born in 1914 into a middle-class family. From a young age, he joined the Komsomol, and after a steady rise in the party apparatus, he was appointed ambassador to Hungary in 1954. There, he directly witnessed the Budapest uprising in 1956, an episode that left a lasting mark on his view of communist order and the necessity of political control. After returning to Moscow, he was integrated into the party's Central Committee, and a decade later, in 1967, was selected by Brezhnev as head of the KGB. From that position, he exercised strict control for 15 years over dissent, foreign espionage, and internal stability. He became one of the most informed leaders in the system, with access to secret reports and surveillance networks. His leadership strengthened the KGB's role as a key instrument of Soviet power. In Brezhnev's final years, Andropov prepared to succeed him. He took advantage of the General Secretary's physical decline and used his influence within the security apparatus to expose corruption linked to Brezhnev's entourage. In November of 1982, he was named General Secretary of the Communist Party in a relatively orderly process. Unlike his predecessor, he aimed to act with greater decisiveness to reactivate the system. Andropov believed that discipline was the foundation of economic recovery. One of his first decisions was to launch a campaign against corruption. He dismissed officials from key ministries, promoted trials against state employees, and reorganized the party apparatus. He ordered raids in workplaces, imposed fines for tardiness, and demanded constant attendance at work. These measures were met with skepticism by a population that had, for years, coexisted with the inefficiency and informality of the system. Personally, Andropov was austere. He avoided excess, rarely attended social events, and projected a sober image. He was methodical, demanding with his collaborators, and reserved. Although he promoted some symbolic gestures, such as visiting a factory in Moscow, his public appearances were limited. He did not promote a personality cult and avoided frequent appearances in the media. His style contrasted with Brezhnev's, who had favored a permanent public image. Ideologically, he did not break with traditional Marxism-Leninism. He maintained the slogan of developed socialism and rejected any substantial revision of the system. However, he acknowledged the need to adapt state management. He allowed some margin for debate within the party and tasked Mikhail Gorbachev and Nikolai Ryzhkov with drafting a report on economic regeneration. Although the document proposed improvements, Andropov did not allow it to incorporate bolder ideas from independent academic circles like the Novosibirsk group, which warned of the structural inefficiency of the Soviet system. One of his most notable initiatives was the promotion of new cadres. He supported the rise of younger figures such as Gorbachev, Ligachev, and Ryzhkov. He reorganized the party's central apparatus to reduce the weight of older officials who had been promoted during Brezhnev's era. He aimed to create an environment favorable to change without provoking internal confrontations. His strategy was functionally reformist, but without altering the essential political structure. In foreign policy, he regained the initiative. In 1983, he proposed to the United States a formal agreement to avoid attacks on member countries of their respective military alliances. He also attempted to revive détente, which had stalled since the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. However, his image in the West remained tied to his KGB past. Ronald Reagan identified him with the evil empire and rejected Soviet proposals. Tensions escalated further after the downing of flight KAL-07, a South Korean commercial airplane that entered Soviet airspace. The episode triggered a secret crisis, during which Andropov ordered a state of maximum nuclear alert, convinced that the United States might be preparing an attack. During this period, his health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from chronic kidney disease, which forced him to spend long periods convalescing. From the spring of 1983, he stopped regularly attending Politburo meetings. His communications were made through notes sent from his residence. In practice, power began to shift to other members of the Presidium, especially Konstantin Chernenko and Mikhail Gorbachev, who alternated in presiding over meetings. Although he preferred Gorbachev as his successor, he was unable to secure that option. In one of his last writings addressed to the Central Committee, he expressed that preference, but the document was altered by Chernenko's supporters before its official presentation. Andropov died on February 9, 1984. He had spent only 15 months in power. His administration was brief, but it generated expectations of renewal that ultimately were not fully realized. At his death, many reformists considered him a transitional figure. For some, he represented the opportunity for a slow but steady reform. For others, he had not gone far enough. During his short term, he managed to dismiss 1/5 of the provincial first secretaries, improved some industrial indicators, and allowed limited circulation of reformist ideas within the party. However, his cautious approach, lack of time, and poor health limited the reach of his plans. Konstantin Chernenko. A weak mandate at the close of an era, Konstantin Chernenko was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party in February of 1984, after the death of Yuri Andropov. His appointment was a compromise decision within the Soviet leadership. Although he was seriously ill, he was seen as someone who would not change course or disrupt the balance between the various factions in power. He did not represent a new project, but rather the continuation of a conservative line that had taken shape during Brezhnev's era. Chernenko was neither a prominent nor a charismatic figure. He had built his career within the party apparatus, primarily in administrative roles. His relationship with Brezhnev, developed since the 1950s, allowed him to advance until he reached high-ranking posts in the 1970s. He had been secretary of the Central Committee since 1976 and joined the Politburo in 1978. He always worked from the background without visible personal ambition. When he assumed leadership, he was already in very poor physical condition. During his brief time in power, he did not promote major changes. He proposed no reforms and reversed no previous decisions. The government operated with little initiative. The only significant action was the continuation of a river diversion project in Siberia, inherited from earlier plans. It was a costly initiative with dubious environmental impact, typical of the technical approaches of the past. No new economic policies or proposals to modernize the system were debated. His health condition kept him away from most meetings. When he appeared in public, he delivered brief speeches or had others speak on his behalf. Important decisions were made collectively or left pending. The country's problems continued to accumulate: low agricultural output, inefficient industry, lack of innovation, and social discontent. None of these issues were actively addressed by the new leadership. In that context, other leaders began to gain space. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had been promoted by Andropov, began coordinating Secretariat and Politburo meetings when Chernenko could not attend. With a younger image and proposals to revise economic management, he became a visible figure within the apparatus. Without breaking the rules, he began building support without directly confronting the General Secretary. Within the leadership group, there was no consensus on succession. Some, like Viktor Grishin and Grigory Romanov, tried to position themselves as heirs, even staging public acts designed to gain prominence. However, none managed to gather sufficient support. Chernenko's image served to maintain balance, although everyone knew his leadership was temporary and could not last much longer. The Central Committee also showed little enthusiasm for his selection. When he was confirmed in the role, the reaction was tepid. There were no ovations or lengthy speeches of support. Most understood it as a provisional solution to avoid internal disputes. In reality, the country remained without clear direction at a time when urgent economic and social decisions were needed. Meanwhile, the economic policy drafts commissioned by Andropov continued to circulate among advisors. Some younger leaders, such as Ryzhkov and Ligachev, used them as a basis to discuss possible adjustments to the management system. Deep reforms were not yet being discussed, but an internal agenda began to take shape with ideas that diverged from traditional approaches. Chernenko's health deteriorated rapidly. He spent long periods in treatment and could not maintain a regular schedule. By early 1985, his appearances were almost non-existent. Decisions were made in his name, but under the practical leadership of others. Government operations depended on informal agreements among the more active Politburo members, especially Gorbachev, who presided over several sessions in his absence. He died on March 10, 1985. His death caused little reaction. The funeral was modest, without major displays of emotion. He had been in office just over a year, leaving behind no significant decisions or new proposals. He was the last leader directly linked to Brezhnev's generation. His time in power marked the end of an era that had lasted 2 decades, characterized by immobility and a preference for control over transformation. The succession was resolved immediately. The following day, Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the party. Mikhail Gorbachev, Reforms, Crisis and the End of the Soviet Union. He assumed leadership of the Soviet Union on March 11, 1985, following the death of Konstantin Chernenko. He was the youngest leader to take office since Stalin. Born in 1931 into a peasant family in southern Russia, he spent his youth on a kolkhoz and worked in the fields before studying law at Moscow State University. Upon returning to Stavropol, he began working in the Komsomol apparatus, thus launching his political career. In the 1970s, he was promoted to high-ranking party positions and in 1980 joined the Politburo. From the beginning, Gorbachev expressed his intention to renew the Soviet system. In the first months, he promoted rotation of cadres, replacing veteran leaders with younger figures. Economically, he launched a campaign against corruption and sought to improve productivity. However, he soon realized these measures were not enough. The crisis was structural and required deeper transformations. In 1986, he introduced two key concepts, perestroika and glasnost. The former meant restructuring and referred to reforming the economic and administrative system. The latter, translated as openness, implied allowing greater freedom of expression and criticism. From then on, censorship was reduced and public debates emerged in the media, universities, and cultural institutions. Gorbachev did not seek to dismantle the Soviet system. His goal was to adapt it to new conditions. He wanted to preserve the Communist Party, but with new practices. He supported laws allowing the creation of private cooperatives and some autonomy for state enterprises. He also promoted internal elections in the Soviets, with more than one candidate per position, something that had not occurred since the early years of the regime. The reform was not welcomed by all. Many within the apparatus feared losing their privileges. In 1987, several of Gorbachev's allies in the Politburo began to distance themselves. Still, he pressed forward. He allowed the return of dissident Andrei Sakharov and supported the publication of books critical of the Soviet past. In 1988, his influence in the Central Committee was solidified, and he was elected President of the Supreme Soviet. In foreign policy, Gorbachev met with Presidents Reagan and Bush. He unilaterally reduced the size of the Soviet military and withdrew troops from Afghanistan. He declared that Warsaw Pact countries could choose their own governments without Moscow's intervention. This decision marked the beginning of the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and soon after, communist governments were replaced in almost every country of the bloc. Although Gorbachev did not directly promote these changes, he did not prevent them. His policy enabled a non-violent exit from communism in Europe. This attitude was celebrated in the West. He received numerous awards and recognitions and was for a time one of the most popular figures in the world. However, within the USSR his image was different. Many saw him as responsible for disorder and economic decline. Between 1989 and 1990, the Soviet republics began demanding more autonomy. In the Baltic states and the Caucasus, nationalist movements emerged. Lithuania declared independence. In other republics like Ukraine and Georgia, demands for separation grew. Gorbachev tried to preserve national unity through a new union treaty, but support for the central government continued to weaken. At the same time, Boris Yeltsin emerged, having left the Communist Party and leading the opposition from the Russian Republic. He was elected president of the Russian Supreme Soviet and became Gorbachev's main rival. While Gorbachev tried to preserve the USSR, Yeltsin advanced toward establishing an independent Russia. The rivalry between them further deepened the division of power in the final years of the Soviet Union. In August of 1991, a group of conservative leaders attempted a coup. Gorbachev was isolated at his vacation residence. The coup failed thanks to resistance led by Yeltsin in Moscow. After the attempt, Gorbachev's power was even more weakened. The Communist Party was suspended, and the republics began declaring their independence definitively. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. The next day, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. He had governed for 6 years. During that time, he tried to change the system from within, but ended up being the leader who presided over its disintegration. He is remembered as a reformer who opened spaces for freedom, but failed to control the consequences of his decisions. For more than 40 years, The Soviet leaders who came to power after the end of the Second World War shaped the destiny of the country. Some tried to preserve the model they had helped consolidate. Others sought to modify it from within. Some concentrated absolute control and fell suddenly. Others promoted change but faced a system that resisted any transformation. The passage of time did not bring a continuous line. Some remained in power for years. Others were removed within a few months. Centralized planning, constant surveillance, and obedience to the party remained core pillars, although each leadership left its own mark. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the era of those who had led the state since the victory over Germany also came to an end. None succeeded in ensuring stable continuity. Their trajectories reveal how power was organized, how it was sustained, and how it ultimately disappeared.